In this lesson, I'd like to talk to you about how the body maintains its water levels and the pH balance using the kidneys and the hormones that are produced elsewhere that will control the kidneys. A couple terms you need to know first. The first one is diuresis. Diuresis means anytime you're losing water through the kidneys. This is a normal process that's supposed to happen. Diuretic is any chemical compound that causes diuresis. So diuretic would be increasing urine output. Things like caffeine, lots of water-soluble vitamins. If you're having too many vitamin Bs, they will be excreted in the urine as well, and that'll draw water out. Alcohol, which blocks another chemical called vasopressin. And then watermelon as well. Surprisingly, watermelon is also a diuretic. Antidiuretics would be any chemical that stops you from losing water. In other words, you retain the water. So this would decrease your urine output. Things like licorice, and there's some herbs out there as well. The basic idea is that if you increase your water intake, then you should have an increased urine output. And if you decrease your water intake or you lose more water through sweat, etc., then you should decrease your urine output. More water in, more water out. Less water in, less water out. And that's the balance that the kidneys are going to maintain. Now, this is controlled by both the nervous system and the endocrine system working hand in hand. Keep in mind, you also have electrolytes that are going to be part of this process, things like sodium, potassium, and chloride ions. And these are going to influence where the water is moving to. And remember that if this is the nephron tube that you see here, if you've got a lot of sodium, which is going to mostly be in the interstitial tissue between the nephron and the capillary, if it's sitting in here, that's going to draw water from the nephron into the interstitial space, and then the proteins that are flowing through the blood tubes are going to draw the water the rest of the way while the sodium is being pumped in. If I can move the electrolytes around, then I can influence the direction that the water is being moved. If you want to lose water, you throw more ions towards the nephron, and then the water will follow. Now, the sodium here is going to maintain a slight difference in electrical charge. This is called membrane potential. This is really important for generating what we call an action potential for either nerve or muscle contraction. So when nerves are firing, they need to have these sodium ions flowing in order to change the voltage on the nerve and send the electrical message. But you'll see that in a different lesson. And again, sodium is required for transporting any kind of fluids. You also have different versions of the sodium pumps that you saw in the other lesson on the formation of urine. So let's briefly talk about two very important hormones that are going to help us to regulate how much water is actually left in the body. The first one is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Hopefully you can see if it's called antidiuretic, then it should be preventing urine from being produced. In other words, we're going to try to retain or reclaim as much water as possible. So it's going to regulate osmotic pressure of the body fluids by increasing water reabsorption in the kidneys. It's produced by the hypothalamus, specifically the osmoreceptor nerves in the hypothalamus, and it gets stored in the posterior pituitary gland. So the problem that would happen would be that you would have an increased fluid loss. In other words, you've sweated too much, etc., etc. You've lost a lot of fluid, you're dehydrated, and that's going to increase the blood's osmotic pressure. This is the blood's draw on water from the tissues, which is going to end up dehydrating them. So you go through water loss. That means you actually increase the blood solute concentration. It's now hypertonic to the tissues, increasing the blood's osmotic pressure, draws water from the cells into the blood vessels, and dehydrates the tissue. This is a problem. So how does the body actually know that that's happening? Well, those little osmoreceptors, the little cells, the nerve cells that are in the hypothalamus, they actually detect the change because they begin to shrink. And when they shrink, they initiate what's called the trigger, the thirst signal. So then the hypothalamus, knowing that it has shrunk down, the nerves then send a message to the pituitary gland and tell it to release ADH, or release antidiuretic hormone. That gets dumped into the blood and goes to the kidneys. Now keep in mind, 85% of the water is already being reabsorbed through the proximal tubule, which is, here's the Bowman's capsule, here's the proximal tubule here, and the descending loop of Henle. Remember that descending is really important for water reabsorption. Ascending is important for salt. So proximal tubule and the loop of Henle are already absorbing 85% of the water. We've only lost 15% of the urine, But if I'm dehydrated, I want to try to reclaim as much of that water as I possibly can. So the ADH then is going to make the upper part of the distal tubule and the collecting duct. So these are my last two chances to save water. So this part here, the distal tubule going across the top here, and the collecting duct become more permeable to water. That means I can take the water that is in it, the filtrate, on its way to the bladder, and rescue it and put it back into the blood. So then the result then is that because the kidneys have increased the water reabsorption, the tissues rehydrate, which means that the shrunken hypothalamus goes back to normal, and I can stop the thirst signal. That means I'm going to have some more concentrated urine than I had before. This is when your urine gets a little bit darker and it's not quite as clear. Urine should be almost clear, slight yellow tinge. If you have dark urine all the time, it's because you're dehydrated all the time and you really need to be drinking more water. So again, the negative feedback was more water being reabsorbed, concentration of the blood solute goes back to normal, decreases. That means the blood's osmotic pressure decreases, which means that the hypothalamus cells go back to normal size, and that nerve message that please help us, we're thirsty message to the pituitary stops. Now you don't have the ADH being released anymore from the pituitary. That means that you stop sending the message to the collecting duct in the distal tubule, and less water gets reabsorbed. So I'm back to normal. This is my negative feedback, or my back to normal response. Okay? And you can take a look at this picture in your note. It's telling you exactly the same thing I've just told you. I'm not going to belabor it right now. Then we have aldosterone. Aldosterone is really important for regulating blood pressure by adjusting how much volume there is in the blood. The higher the volume, so the more liquid you have in the blood, the more pressure you should have on the tubes of the blood. So they go hand in hand. If you increase blood volume, you'll increase blood pressure. If you decrease blood volume, you'll decrease blood pressure. Now, aldosterone is actually produced by the adrenal glands. Here's a picture of the kidneys, and here's a picture of the location of the adrenal glands. Notice that the adrenal glands have a cortex, which is the outside section, and the medulla, which is the inside section. Very similar to the idea of what we talked about with kidneys. But these happen to be producing two very, very different sets of hormones when we're talking about the adrenal glands. Adrenal literally means right near the kidneys. Renal, there's the kidney word. All right. So what's the problem that aldosterone is responding to? There's an increased fluid loss. And when you are dehydrated and you've increased your fluid loss, then you can lead to your low blood pressure, just like we said, because you've got the low blood volume. And then that means that you have a reduced oxygen and nutrients being delivered to the cells. That's a problem. You're trying to fix that problem. How do you know that you have that problem? Well, right next to where the glomerulus is, remember that the glomerulus is the little high pressure capillary bed that is surrounded by the Bowman's capsule. And it is where you're going to have very, very high pressure. So juxta just means beside. So the cells that are right beside the glomerular apparatus, because the pressure has dropped, they're not getting slammed with the blood pressure quite as high. And if the pressure has dropped, it means that I have lower filtration happening. Then these are in just exactly the right position in order to figure out that the blood pressure has dropped. And when they do that, these cells, the JA cells, release a compound called renin. Renin then converts the plasma protein angiotensinogen. Anytime you see OGin, it means it hasn't been turned on yet. So it's going to convert this plasma protein called angiotensinogen, which is a liver enzyme, into its turned on form, which is angiotensin. Angiotensin's job then is to constrict the blood vessels. That means that the diameter of the arteries is going to decrease. And that means because I'm squeezing the tube, I've got the same volume in a smaller tube, I'm going to increase the blood pressure. When you do that, that's the trigger to release aldosterone from the adrenal gland. So when blood pressure increases, the adrenal gland knows to start releasing aldosterone. When the aldosterone then moves to the kidneys, it's going to do a very similar thing, but in this case, rather than making the kidneys more permeable to water the way that the ADH does, this one is going to increase sodium reabsorption. And when you increase the sodium reabsorption, the water follows. So I'm going to take sodium and I'm going to put it back into the blood from the distal tubule and the collecting duct. Water will follow that naturally because of the osmotic gradient. and then my blood fluid will increase. So again, if I'm having trouble with my blood pressure, I've got low blood pressure, it's because I've got low blood volume. So if I can increase the blood volume, then I can increase my pressure. So the increased salt reabsorption, sodium specifically reabsorption, increases the osmotic gradient of the nephron. In other words, it can draw water, and then the water moves from the nephron back to the blood. And here's the picture that goes along with that conversation, and you're welcome to take a look at that on your note as well. Now let's chat about regulating your blood pH levels. There are two important compounds that we're going to be dealing with. The first one is carbonic acid, and the second one is the bicarbonate buffer. This is what's going to be making sure that we don't get too acidic in the blood. The blood pH level always needs to be somewhere between 7.3 and 7.5, so ever so slightly basic. And the reason we want it to be within that range is that allows the enzymes and other proteins to function and for chemical reactions to occur. If you start messing with this in the blood, then things start to go awry. Just a reminder that carbon dioxide gets produced during cellular respiration, and when carbon dioxide, here you see in this picture here, when carbon dioxide and water are in the same place at the same time, you get carbonic acid. So when the CO2 from the tissues diffuses out into the blood plasma, where there's a lot of water, you're going to immediately form carbonic acid. You do not want the acid to be floating in that way through the blood vessels. So you're going to have to take the carbonic acid and adjust it and shift it. And what we'll end up doing is we will end up splitting the carbonic acid into a bicarbonate ion, which is basic, and this little proton here. And the proton can be removed in the kidneys, and the bicarbonate ion can be rescued and reabsorbed in the kidneys so that I can get rid of the acidic portion and I can keep the basic version, which will keep me in the basic range of pH. The other thing that we can do is we can shift it back in this direction. So perhaps it becomes carbonic acid as soon as it hits the blood, but when I actually carry it through the blood out to the lungs, I'm going to carry it as the bicarbonate ion. And then when I get to the lungs, I can shift backwards, go back to carbonic acid, go back to the CO2 version, and then the CO2 can diffuse out in the lungs and be breathed out in your next breath. So that's how we do it. We shift back and forth between these different modes of carbonic acid versus the bicarbonate, and we're able to safely carry the carbon dioxide and manage to deal with our pH levels as well. So if you get too acidic, those extra protons will need to be removed because they're lowering your pH. So the bicarbonate ions will bind. So if I've got lots of these ones there, these ones are available to soak them up. And then the carbonic acid gets shifted this direction and that gets removed. I'm just left with water. Then I just need to replace the buffer for next time. And that again is after the carbon dioxide gets transported from the peritubular capillaries, which are surrounding the nephron, and mixed with the water to form the carbonic acid. Then the carbonic acid dissociates, that means it falls apart into these two particular things. I can reclaim the bicarbonate and I can expel the hydrogen ion. And they can also recombine with phosphate ions or become ammonium. So ammonia becomes ammonium, and that gets excreted in the filtrate as well in the kidneys. Here's the picture that goes along with that conversation. So again, here's your peritubular capillary. So these are the ones surrounding the nephron. Here's the nephron itself and the tube. So you've got the blood flowing here and you've got the filtrate flowing here. Carbon dioxide from the blood can come into the tubule cells, and that can be converted to, with the water that's in the cells, be converted to the carbonic acid. That can get converted to this combination here. Then the carbonate can be put back into the blood along with the sodium that you're going to rescue, can be put back into the blood, and then the protons or the hydrogen ions can move into the lumen, where you can either shift back again, or you can take those guys and you can create ammonium or phosphoric acid. These are going to remain in the filtrate and they will be sent out in the urine. So it's pretty complicated where you can shift back and forth, but I just basically need you to know that the bicarbonate is the buffer that's going to help us to reduce our acid, and we can shift it in all different ways. Just take a look at this and spend a little bit of time staring at it, and maybe it'll come clear to you. That is the end of this lesson.